Paul goes to Ephesus, and he, at the amphitheater, preaches the gospel there for the very first time. You see it, the boot of Italy, go over to Greece, drop down to Turkey. You see Asia Minor there? Take a look at Turkey as we zoom in. Right there in Turkey was a church called Ephesus, started by Paul when he left Antioch, and he established a church called Ephesus. The book of the Ephesians mentioned also in the book of Revelation. It's part of the 7 churches. You see up north, Smyrna there? Well, to the book of Ephesians, Jesus promised that he would give pastors and teachers to help the church grow, and he did. Polycarp, the convert and personal pupil and friend of John the Apostle, who pastored a church not too far up the road in Smyrna. This is written history, and we have several converts of the Apostle John, Polycarp and Papias. While Irenaeus is a pupil of Polycarp, he was positioned as the pastor there in Lyons, sent there by Polycarp himself. We know from history that Polycarp ordained Irenaeus as the pastor there because there was a massive persecution under Aurelius, the Caesar of Rome. The previous pastor in Lyon had been executed and martyred, so Irenaeus, being a pupil and a disciple of Polycarp, was placed there as the pastor of that church. And that, my friend, is a fact of history. As a personal disciple of Polycarp, Irenaeus would have first-hand knowledge of who wrote the books to the New Testament, because you can be sure John knew who wrote the New Testament. Clearly, the New Testament tells us that it was John who was leaning on the Lord's breast at the Last Supper, and this is confirmed by Irenaeus. And how would he know that? Well, my friend, he was a disciple of Polycarp, and Polycarp converted to Christianity by John the Apostle. Period. The testimony is sure. We learn from him that John the Apostle, in fact, did go to the island of Patmos, and after he was released, went to Ephesus and pastored the church there. He appointed Polycarp as the pastor of Smyrna, and in turn, Polycarp appointed Irenaeus as the pastor of France, once the pastor there had been martyred by Caesar, as I've said. Now listen carefully. Let's go to the west, because that's what's happening in the east, in Antioch, and we know there was a revival in Rome. Clearly in Rome there was a revival there, and we know from history that Clement of Rome was the pastor there, and he was appointed there by Peter the Apostle, and that's an established fact of history, and everything I'm telling you is corroborated by all the pastors living in the 2nd century. What's happening in Antioch, what's happening in the West in Rome is all supported by the history with written documents. We know as an established fact of history coming from these men that both Peter and Paul established the Church of Rome. They didn't start it. It was already started long before they got there. Going back to the east, we see Ignatius there. My. Ignatius of Antioch, the pastor that was there when Paul was heading out on his missionary journeys, and we draw lots of good history from him. All these men wrote letters to the very churches that were started by the apostles. Clement of Rome wrote a letter to the Corinthians. Ignatius wrote many letters. On top of that, Clement of Rome is the one thought of mentioned in the New Testament, and Ignatius is the one by tradition sitting on the lap of Jesus. And my friend, this was the majority position held by all the scholars for 2,000 years, until just recently. And let me draw your attention to what Paul said prior to the return of Christ. There's a great falling away coming from the Christian faith. Now I want to talk about Papias. We're talking about Papias of Hierapolis. Hierapolis wasn't even far from Ephesus, and these men all knew each other because he was converted to Christianity by John the Apostle. You see Hierapolis? And look at the 7 churches, several mentioned there, Laodicea, Philadelphia, and Ephesus is not far from there. Papias is a hearer of the Apostle John. He knew him personally. Irenaeus informs us that that's a fact of history. He goes on to inform us that Polycarp and Papias were companions, And Papias, my friend, makes it very clear the apostles wrote the New Testament books, and on top of that, succeeded by him was Polycrates, who, along with Irenaeus, call him the ancient man, meaning he was there from the beginning. We have eyewitness account to the Apostle John. Now, people today are leery to use the Apostolic Fathers for obvious reasons. Both the Catholic and the Greek Orthodox Church make claim to Peter as their successors. But listen to me carefully. Nowhere are Apostolic Fathers called fathers. They're referred to as elders, and the word literally means an overseer. So here it is. We know that the Apostle John led Polycarp and Papias to the Lord. And we know Irenaeus is a personal pupil of Polycarp, and he wrote a 5-volume encyclopedia, including information that was delivered no different than the way Plutarch delivered information about Alexander the Great. Now, Plutarch is 400 years after Alexander the Great, along with Arrian, and they made the first biography of Alexander the Great, using 5 sources, copies of copies with missing pages. Yet it's acceptable history. Plutarch gives us that information 400 years later. Irenaeus gives us that information as an eyewitness account to Polycarp and says Polycarp got it from John. Let's take a look at what Papias said. He says that John was definitely in Asia Minor as the pastor at Ephesus, and he lived to the reign of Caesar Trajan, who died in 120 AD. Now listen, it was witnessed in past tense as Papias was looking for information concerning the apostles coming from men that knew them. Past tense demonstrating they were already dead. But in the present tense talks about John hearing his voice because John was still alive. He bore witness to John, and Irenaeus says so. He was a companion of Polycarp. They were the best of friends. He wrote 5 books. He gave an accurate account of what was told to him by the men that knew the apostles in the past tense because they're already dead. And he wrote it down. An interesting point is the 10th statement he makes about Mary. I'll get back to it. He claims accurately that Papias saw John, and he was the one that was leaning on the Lord's breast at the Lord's Supper. He quotes the book of Matthew, 1 Corinthians, the book of John, and massive debates on the book of Revelation. He knew Philip and the daughters of Philip. He talks about how Mark was an interpreter of Peter, and Luke was also an interpreter of Paul. And that's the point to the gospel. Matthew and John know Jesus, and Mark and Luke, they know the leading apostles, and you should know it's Peter and Paul. Probably the most important statement made by Papias is this one, where Papias says he had made inquiries about the words of the elders. And like I said, the apostles were elders. He goes on to say, I made inquiry about what the words of the elders, what Andrew or Peter had said. He knew that Andrew and Peter were brothers. And he says, or Philip. And by the way, Philip went to Hierapolis, had girls. He was married and pastored and evangelized there. And so he says, I inquired about the words of the elders. Look now, or of Thomas, or James, or John, or Matthew. It's in the past tense. Look, I made inquiries about the words of the elders, what Andrew or Peter had said. And obviously, they're dead. Papias is writing later in life at the time where John the Apostle is alive and away from the island of Patmos. Now look what he places in the present tense. He says, from the beginning, I made inquiries about the words of the elders. Now look what he drops down in the present tense. He says, or any other of the Lord's disciples, he says, and whatever Ariston, who was a companion of John, and John the elder, in the present tense, the Lord's disciple were saying in the present tense. The idea that Ariston and John together, 2 by 2, is not uncommon. There's Silas and Paul, Barnabas and Paul. There's, by the way, Mark and Peter, and then Luke and John. So it's a continuum. There's no getting out of it. And in the present tense, he says this, watch, for I did not want to think that information from books would profit me as much as information from the living, watch now, and the surviving voice. Of who? Of John the Elder. And by the way, John is called an elder in the epistles of John. He went to Ephesus, pastored the church there. Now, to any Christian who's educated and watching over the flock of God as an elder would notice 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 right away, where Paul warns of false letters written in the apostles' names. And we see them today, those Gnostic Gospels. None of them are first century. Everything we know about the Gospels in the Bible are all first century, along with every book of the New Testament. So Paul warns about false letters. So you can certainly understand why Polycarp makes it clear when he says, for I did not think that the information from the books would profit me as much as that surviving voice, the abiding voice in the present tense of John the Apostle. Listen carefully. Are you following Gnostic Gospels, or are you following the very books these men were quoting in the first century as the Word of God, collected by the Protestant Reformation? Now, you might have heard this silly argument that this is not the same John. It's a different John. But that's an even bigger problem, because if it's a different John, we have two Johns at Ephesus. Therefore, the second John would know the first John, and the first John would know the second John. And Polycarp would also know the first John and the second John. And he would also give that information to Irenaeus, who would know the first John. Now, if it was two different Johns, John the Apostle would know Jesus, the second John would know John, you'd still have a problem. And that's because these two Johns would have been at Ephesus at the same time, both corroborating that consecutive witness. At the end, Eusebius never believed Papias, but he sure changed his mind in the book called the Chronicles. And it was also supported by Tertullian that these men in fact were associated and knew John the Apostle personally.